Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to the FCPA Compliance Report. This is a special bonus presentation of the FCPA Compliance Report. I'm joined by Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitors, and we take a look at our initial thoughts on the Walmart FCPA enforcement action that was announced last week. This is certainly one of the largest, most significant FCPA cases in some time, even if the fine and penalty is only $282 million. It's gone on at least 7 or 8 years. It's a massive internal matter for Walmart, having spent nearly $1 billion in overall cost of both remediation and pre-settlement investigation. Now we have a $282 million, and they've been imposed with a monitor, so they will have additional costs going forward. So it is, I think, one of the most significant enforcement actions of the year. There's a lot to dissect, digest, slice and dice, and we're going to try to give it a start in this podcast. I hope that you will enjoy it. This is a special bonus presentation of the FCPA Compliance Report, which is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network and now a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I am here with Mr. Monitors, Jay Rosen, and we are going to take a look at the Walmart FCPA enforcement action, which came out Thursday of this past week. It is certainly one of the most anticipated FCPA enforcement actions, literally since the New York Times broke the story back in April of 2012. So, Jay, first of all, what were your kind of initial thoughts?
Well, first of all, I was kind of shocked by the way it just kind of went out there in the universe, because we've been following this matter, actually prior to the New York Times. We've, I think, first heard about it in the fall of 2011. So for it just to kind of sneak out on a Thursday afternoon, you and I were getting to record this week at FCPA. So not surprised by the numbers, but just really surprised at the length it took to get this one over the finish line. And, a lot of times in these global investigations, it's kind of like seeing the tip of the iceberg, that there's a lot that's happened beneath leading up into that point. And, what I think you and I will cover in this podcast is, number one, what took them so long to get to this point. Part of it we're going to look at is the changeover from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, and what signals did they see to get that penalty down. And now to get this at 230 million-ish or so, it's a very good outcome. And, now what you have to look at is the company going forward. They have the best program that $1 billion combined. The proof in the pudding is this, will this program work going forward? And, you can't rest on your laurels and now having the best that $1 billion can buy, but you've got to actually show that, does this compliance program work, and will it prevent future missteps? So those are my initial thoughts. Yours, Tom?
So I certainly agree that this has been one of the most readily anticipated. The number, which was finally derived, that we're going to hopefully take some detail into, was right at what Walmart reserved about a year ago. So there's really no surprise in the total number of fine and penalty and profit disgorgement. I was talking to one overseas colleague, and he was just distraught at the number was so low. And I sort of opined that when you have fines and penalties for licenses, the numbers tend to be lower than if you're actually paying for contracts. So I think that was certainly one reason the number was lower. One of the reasons you mentioned, Jay, the nearly $1 billion in pre-settlement costs expended by Walmart, I think had to play into that. The other thing is the conduct, while certainly egregious on multiple levels, occurred as far back as 2000. The Mexico conduct that was the highlighted in the New York Times piece, and in the plea agreement NPA and SEC cease and desist order occurred, I think, was largely over by 2005, 2006, although there were continued problems, I think, acknowledged in all three of those documents up to the 2011 timeframe. The self-disclosure or not was really unclear to me, Jay. And I say that because the SEC order said that the company had self-disclosed to the commission around Mexico in November 2011. And thereafter, the Walmart disclosed its findings regarding corruption in Brazil, China, and India. The Department of Justice said that Walmart disclosed potential corruption in Brazil to it, subsequently disclosed potential corruption in China and India, but did not disclose conduct in Mexico until after the Department of Justice was investigating it. So, and they all gave different levels of credit for that. So I was a little bit confused by the self-disclosure or not. On the one hand, you had the SEC saying they self-disclosed in Mexico, but not in Brazil, China, and India, and the DOJ saying they self-disclosed in Brazil, but not in the other countries. So the formula for the criminal penalty against Walmart under the U.S. sentencing guidelines was, frankly, its typical machination of numbers, which are somewhat difficult to fully work through. But one thing caught me was that under the sentencing guidelines, there is a potential reduction in your overall culpability score based on the following. The organization fully cooperated in the investigation and clearly demonstrated recognition and affirmative acceptance of its responsibility for criminal conduct. You can get up to a -5 for that. And Walmart got a -2. So that means something was lacking. And I'm not quite sure what that something was. The bribery schemes generally involved third parties. In Mexico, it was third-party intermediaries. Brazil, the same. In China. In India, third party was really a joint venture partner. So we had a wide variety of structural corruption. The final point of why the fine and penalty may have been at the level it was is that it's not referenced at all in any of these settlement documents. But I think all of the principals who were involved in terms of being senior execs at the time have all retired or otherwise left the company. And certainly the former GC, former CEO, former board members have left the company. And so once again, this is not referenced in any of the settlement documents, but I would have to opine that gave some, the enforcement agencies in the form of SEC and DOJ gave some credit to Walmart for moving out the people who allowed the corruption to go forward. So the fines and penalties, I think, were right around what we typically have seen in the past in these kinds of licensing cases, even if it appeared, as Matt Kelly articulated, that it would take Walmart 5 hours of gross profits to pay for all of this fine and penalty. So you want to maybe go into some of the specific areas of corruption, Jay?
Yeah, I just, before we go into there, I wanted to get your thought about, is this a big nothing burger after all this time now, or is it significant? Because you just stated that the penalties seem to be commensurate with kind of getting permitting, like we've seen in these kind of cases. So, pundits have said at one point this was going to be one of the most significant FCPA rulings ever to come down the pike. Now that we're at the other end, how significant is this, and what are the lessons that we should be deriving moving forward?
So, Jay, from where I sit, it is one of the most significant. Anytime you have the world's largest retailers, anytime they do something, it's significant. Well, I can't remember the name who quoted it, but it's too good of a quote to say it without the name. But the anytime Walmart does something, I think that's significant. The real significance to me, Jay, was the number you alluded to, nearly $1 billion in pre-settlement remediation and investigative costs. And I think that number should be used for multiple reasons. One reason is it shows, number one, the real cost of a company which gets caught up in an FCPA investigation, massive or otherwise. It's always a large multiple of the actual fine and penalty. So here we have, between a third and a fourth, or 3 and 4 times rather. And we haven't even gotten to the monitor yet. So, there's going to be additional costs beyond nearly 1 billion, 282. So that's, nearly 1.3 billion. And then we're going to have the post-resolution costs of the monitor, whatever those might be. So if you look at it in a very holistic approach, the number is very significant. But if we just focus on the pre-settlement numbers and think about what Walmart could have saved if they did have an effective compliance program and had actually operationalized, but more importantly, done compliance. Walmart had a paper program in place, and they had a paper program in place as early as 2003. It was not followed. They revised that program later in the decade. That was not followed. There were numerous instances in both the DOJ documents and the SEC documents. So if you, rather than complain about the number Walmart had to spend, I think the proper analysis is FCPA was enacted in 1977, and Walmart did not really put an effective compliance program in until this information that led to this enforcement action became known to them at the highest levels, and someone woke up and made the decision, we've got to self-disclose this because the New York Times would have broken the story anyway because they had the information from one of the original whistleblowers in Mexico. So I think the total numbers really point to why this is important. The pre-settlement costs really point to what can happen to a company if they don't take compliance and ethics seriously. And then I think Walmart is to be heartily congratulated that was not, I think, driven home from the settlement documents. But they have, as you have suggested, put in a best-in-class compliance program. Whatever their faults and errors prior to this time may have been, whatever the theory or business practices of the prior management, they have completely turned it around. They have put in truly a best-in-class compliance program. They have been open and transparent about that in terms of certainly going to conferences and talking about their program, but more importantly, releasing reports to the public, transparency reports on the state of their compliance program. And I think they are rightfully proud of their compliance program. And so I think that's also a really important lesson to be learned, that you can make a comeback if senior management is committed to doing compliance, and it's doing compliance. It's not having a paper program. And I guess finally, the last point is that this case really just serves as, if we need another death knell for the compliance defense, this case really serves as the absolute death knell for it. Because as I mentioned, Walmart had a compliance program in 2000, as early as 2003. In 2008 and 9, they revised it up to 2010. Walmart was, the company was still engaging in bribery and corruption. It was truly a paper program. The program had numerous gaps. It allowed bribery and corruption to continue. Whistleblowers, courageous whistleblowers, stepped forward to give senior management the information about allegations of bribery and corruption. Those allegations were not followed. Whistleblower reports were not followed up. And so for those who really still want a compliance defense, having a compliance program as a defense is just an absolute non-starter. Walmart had one, and they clearly weren't following it until they did. And that when they changed is certainly to be credited to them. But for those who want a compliance defense, this case just absolutely completely eviscerates their argument about why a compliance defense is valid, should be there, or any other reason.
So I want to read a quote from Danforth Newcomb, who's often referred to as kind of like the dean of the U.S. FCPA bar. And it's, quote, "I think the Times story, if true, changes the perception of the Walmart matter from being about facilitation payments to something larger than that." And I think that's where the matter really started to turn, because it wasn't simply just about specific incidents of bribes being paid for permits, but it also became about something more, about a company culture, about whistleblowers, taking the direct allegations to the Mexico area of business, and then to have that land on the desk of the person who was running the fraud. So I think that also really changes how this matter got perceived, from being something, whether you're saying it's about a compliance defense or they're saying about facilitation payments, it really struck more to that structural basis of not having culture there. And I know we've been speaking about that for a large part of this year. In terms of getting just the quick numbers out of the way, or what the fine was for, Walmart and its wholly owned Brazilian subsidiary, Walmart Brasilia SARL, have agreed to pay a combined penalty of $137 million to resolve its violations of the FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Walmart Brasilia pleaded guilty on Thursday in connection with that. In addition to what they did in Brazil, there were also issues that were in Mexico, that were in India, and that were in China. And these, again, were basically about internal control failures that allowed these foreign subsidiaries to pay bribes. We also discussed that the $282 million was split between the DOJ, who got $137 million, with the remainder going to the SEC, which settled with a cease and desist order. So those are the kind of the facts right now. Anything we want to derive from those, Tom?
So I think we kind of touched on the total fines and penalties and how they were derived, and the people who suggest that they were too low. I think we've talked through that as well.
So, Tom, I guess the thing we're going to discuss now is, if you are a retailer who has a similar global footprint to Walmart, or if you're just a company that's doing business globally and you happen to have one of these antique paper programs, what do you think is the first steps that we can tell people how to start going from 0 to 60 and moving their compliance program along?
So the first thing you have to do, Jay, is you have to get a handle on where you are truly internationally in terms of your compliance regime. One of the reasons the Walmart investigative costs pre-settlement were so high is I don't think they had really ever taken a holistic worldwide view of their compliance risk and compliance exposure. Once again, that's not stated anywhere in the settlement documents, but you asked the question of when we started this podcast, why did this take 7 years? And one of the reasons, I think, is they had to do basically a worldwide forensic audit of their entire compliance program to find out what they had and what they didn't have. And so that's the first thing, do a risk assessment. The second thing is that you have to get a handle on monies that you may or may not have paid for licenses, permits, and others. Clearly, the facilitation payment exception to the FCPA is an important exception. you may fall under that exception. But you're only going to fall under that exception if you have documented each payment and that payment is reasonable. And whatever that reasonableness might be, we have had FCPA enforcement actions where as low as $3,000 was deemed not reasonable, and we've had declinations where as high as $10,000 was deemed reasonable. So, what is reasonable is going to depend on the facts and circumstances of each individual case, but you have to get a handle on that. And then the third thing is, and I think this is a direct lesson from Walmart, because Walmart in this, I think it was '08 timeframe when they redid their compliance program for the second time, they said they were going to create or give freedom and flexibility to each country to create a compliance program based upon the business practices of their country. You can't do that. You have to have a centralized compliance program. You have to have visibility from the corporate office, and you have to understand, and the business units operating in different countries have to understand. Corruption may be pervasive in that country, and it may be a tradition in that country, but that's illegal under the FCPA. And while you can make a facilitation payment, it has to be properly recorded and it has to be reasonable. So if you've got a culture that small-ish payments are made to people who do not have a discretionary authority to grant you a license, but have to based upon your submissions, that's one thing. But if you're paying the head of licensing in a particular country thousands of dollars there was a couple of phrases, smooth things out was one phrase, and smooth out the bumps was another phrase. That's going to be problematic.
So here's a little bit of a, I guess, cheeky question. Going back over who's been involved in this matter, we know that Jones Day had led the internal investigation and took the company through settlement. At one point, Greenberg Traurig was helping internationally to roll out the improved ethics and compliance program. And also part of that effort was a Big Four accounting company called KPMG. So they have been in the news as of late. Do you think we need to look back on any of the work that the company's done over the last 7 or 8 years since KPMG was associated with that and where their reputation is as of today?
Well, separate and apart from all of this discussion on Walmart, every company that has hired KPMG, I think, has to take a very hard look at the work they've done, not only in terms of the specific work, but also were the persons who did the work qualified to do so based upon KPMG's own internal requirements. I would first look not at the compliance realm, but perhaps more at the audited financial statements. I don't know if KPMG is the auditor for Walmart or not. If I were the CFO, I would make that inquiry absolutely first. But I think KPMG has put themselves in a position where you can't trust not only anything they've done, but whether their people are even qualified internally, as they say they are, to do the work that they say they are qualified to do.
All right, let me fire another one at you. And, one of the things that we've been speaking about with both the Benczkowski Memo on how monitors work and taking a look at the 2019 updated evaluation guidance is when we take a look at the outcome that we've had now, they're still applying a monitor for 2 years. And Benczkowski says in his writings that you don't really want to have a monitor put on the matter if the company has spent money to self-remediate, if they're moving forward. But then in this case, we see that a monitor, after the company did not come to the government first, but did moderately cooperate. They did give information. They did work on their compliance program. So to bring in Louis Freeh to be the monitor for 2 years, even with a very narrow and scoped focus, once again, does that comment upon the lack of the company's responsiveness? And is the government really concerned that the company still spent $1 million, but they want to get an independent resource to confirm that the program is currently working?
Well, Jay, reading the Benczkowski Memo and the requirements that the Department of Justice has set for itself to impose a monitor, and frankly, me having heard Assistant Attorney General, or rather Deputy Attorney General, Deputy Assistant Attorney General, Benczkowski speak at the ECI 2019 Impact, in his discussion of why Fresenius was required to have a monitor, he said that the Department of Justice wanted, or that Fresenius had not tested its compliance program enough, and that was the reason for the imposition of the monitor. So it was an acknowledgement that Fresenius had put a compliance program in place, but the DOJ didn't feel it had been sufficiently tested. So with those, really that piece of insight plus the Benczkowski memo, I think we have to at least conclude that it is something around the implementation and or testing of the compliance program. That would seem to be the only reason under the Benczkowski memo to put a monitor in place. Although clearly, if you have egregious conduct and you don't cooperate, that could be reasons for a monitor. But that's not the situation here. We had cooperation, at least to some extent, and certainly implementation of a best practices compliance program. So the imposition of the monitor, I think, is going to be around, and what the monitor's charge will be is testing the efficacy and effectiveness of the compliance program going forward, perhaps on a worldwide basis.
So I know I believe last Friday, you started the first of your deep dive unpacks of the Walmart matter. Do you have any preview of what your columns are going to be this week and what you're going to be working with and looking at for this case going forward?
So what I'm going to be looking at is the source documents, the plea agreement, the NPA, the judgment, and the SEC order. What we're going to put up tomorrow, Jay, is the bribery schemes. I'm going to take a look at how Walmart, the response Walmart made that led them to receive the credit. Certainly going to talk about the death knell, hopefully forever, of the compliance defense, and how a Walmart case has settled that issue for all time. And who knows where else the spirit may take me.
Tom, you're going to be wrapping up things and heading off to ACFE. Are you speaking or attending?
So the answer is I'm attending, and I'm in the bullpen waiting for the call for a right-handed either setup guy or closer. I can actually take both roles from the bullpen. So waiting for the signal from the man.
All right. Well, I'm sure we'll hear about it at some point this week. We'd like to thank everyone for tuning in for this emergency weekend podcast on the Walmart FCPA resolution. For Tom Fox, the compliance evangelist, and myself, Mr. Monitor Jay Rosen, we thank you for joining us and have a great week.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this special bonus presentation of the FCPA Compliance Report. I hope you'll check out my multi-part blog post series. I'm not quite sure how far long it will go, but I'm in the middle of it. I've written about the basic background facts, and by the time this podcast goes up, I'll have written about the bribery schemes involved. I'll also take a look at how Walmart made its comeback, the death knell from the compliance defense, and what all this means for the compliance practitioner going forward. If you have any questions, obviously you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. If you need to talk to Jay, he's at jrosen@affiliatedmonitors.com. I hope you'll join us again next week, where I'm going to have a special multi-part series on the FCPA Compliance Report, looking at some issues that I've been thinking about, talking about, and talked to some great folks about. So check that out the week of July 1st. The FCPA Compliance Report is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network and now C-Suite Radio. Thanks so much for listening.